I used to think grief was quiet, that it came softly like a dimming light, something private that stayed inside your chest. I was wrong. Grief, I learned, can be loud. It can rearrange rooms. It can turn familiar faces into strangers. And sometimes, grief doesn't start with death at all. Sometimes it starts when a lawyer clears his throat and says, "We're ready to read the will." That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment the will was read, and my family immediately chose sides. But I didn't know that yet. At that moment, I was just a daughter who hadn't slept properly in weeks. A woman still adjusting to the silence left behind by her mother's absence. A person who believed, foolishly, that no matter what happened next, blood would still mean something. I truly believed that. My mother, Eleanor, had been gone for just under a month. Cancer had taken her faster than any of us were prepared for, even though we'd all seen it coming. There's a strange cruelty in watching someone fade slowly. You grieve them in pieces before they're even gone, and then somehow, when the end finally comes, it still feels like a shock. She had been the glue in our family, not in an obvious way. She wasn't loud or controlling. She didn't host elaborate dinners or force closeness, but she remembered birthdays. She smoothed tensions before they hardened. She made excuses for people when no one else would. When she died, that glue dissolved. We didn't fall apart immediately. Not on the surface. We hugged at the funeral. We cried together. My older brother, Mark, even held my hand during the service, something he hadn't done since we were kids. My younger sister, Claire, sobbed into my shoulder and kept saying she didn't know how to be an adult without Mom. For a brief moment, standing beside her grave, we looked like a family again. That illusion lasted exactly 3 weeks. The lawyer's office was colder than it needed to be. Not temperature-wise, but emotionally. The kind of place where the chairs are stiff and the walls are bare, as if comfort might interfere with business. We were seated in a loose half-circle, all facing the same polished wooden desk. My father sat closest to the lawyer. He hadn't spoken much since Mom passed. He moved like someone carrying an invisible weight, always slightly hunched, always tired. Mark sat beside him, arms crossed, jaw tight. Claire was next to Mark, her eyes red-rimmed, mascara smudged. Across from us were my mother's sister, Aunt Linda, and her husband, Richard. And then there was me. I sat a little apart, not intentionally, but because no one had gestured for me to sit closer. I remember noticing that. I remember telling myself I was being paranoid. We were all on edge. Grief did that to people. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and gave us a polite, professional smile. He explained the process in a calm, neutral voice, as if this were just another Tuesday morning instead of the unraveling of a family. As he spoke, my mind drifted back to the last months of my mother's life. I had moved back home when her condition worsened. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There were no family meetings or arguments. I simply packed a bag and told my boss I needed time. I had always been the flexible one, the one without kids, the one who lived closest. Mark had his own life across the state. Claire was newly married and overwhelmed with her own responsibilities. Dad didn't know how to take care of himself, let alone someone else. So I stayed. I cooked. I cleaned. I drove Mom to appointments. I sat with her during chemo sessions and held a bucket when she got sick. I learned how to administer medication. I slept on the couch so I could hear her if she called out at night. No one asked me to do these things. I didn't do them expecting anything in return. At least, that's what I told myself. The lawyer's voice snapped me back to the present. He began reading. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect. Legal language, formal acknowledgments, statements of sound mind, funeral arrangements. Nothing controversial. Nothing that made anyone shift in their seat. Then came the distribution of assets. The house was mentioned. My childhood home. The place where we'd grown up, where Mom had painted flowers on the kitchen wall and Dad had installed a crooked bookshelf that still leaned slightly to the left. I felt my chest tighten. The lawyer paused briefly before continuing, his eyes flicking down the page. And then he said my name. Not casually, not as part of a list. He said it clearly, deliberately, as if he knew it mattered. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until Claire inhaled sharply beside me. The house, the lawyer said, had been left to me. Not jointly, not temporarily. To me. I felt heat rush to my face. My ears rang. I glanced around the room, confused, searching for some kind of reaction that might tell me I'd misunderstood. Mark's head snapped toward me. Aunt Linda's lips parted slightly. Richard leaned forward in his chair. My father didn't move at all. The lawyer continued, listing additional assets, smaller things, savings accounts, personal belongings, sentimental items. But the room had already shifted. I could feel it, like a pressure change before a storm. By the time he finished reading, the silence was unbearable. No one spoke. No one congratulated me. No one asked me how I felt. No one even looked directly at me. Instead, they spoke around me. Mark cleared his throat and said, "I just don't understand." Understand what? I wanted to ask, but my voice wouldn't cooperate. Aunt Linda sighed loudly and said, "Your mother must have been under a lot of stress at the end." Claire shook her head, whispering something to Mark that I couldn't hear. And that was it. That was how it started. Not with shouting, not with accusations, but with doubt, as if my mother's final decision was a mistake that needed correcting, as if I had somehow tricked her. We left the office separately. No one waited for me in the parking lot. I stood beside my car, keys in hand, watching them drive away in different directions, feeling like I had just stepped out of a reality I no longer belonged to. That night, my phone stayed silent. No calls. No messages. No, "Are you okay?" I told myself they needed time. I told myself grief made people act strangely. But deep down, something cold and unfamiliar had begun to settle in my chest. The next day, Mark called. His tone was polite. Too polite. The kind of politeness people use when they're trying not to say what they really think. He asked me if we could talk. I said yes. He suggested coffee. Neutral ground. We met at a cafe halfway between our houses. He arrived early and had already ordered. He didn't hug me when I walked in. We talked about the weather, about traffic, about nothing. Then he leaned back and said, "I think we need to be honest." That sentence changed everything. He asked me if I knew about the will ahead of time. I said no. He asked me if Mom had ever mentioned changing it. I said she hadn't. He asked me if I thought it was fair. Fair. I looked at my brother, the man who had moved out at 18 and rarely visited, who had missed most of Mom's appointments, who had called once a week if that. I didn't know how to answer without setting something on fire. "I didn't ask for this," I said carefully. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that response. "I know, but intentions don't change outcomes." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about what Mom wanted. It was about what everyone else felt entitled to. Over the next few days, the family split quietly, efficiently, like they'd been waiting for an excuse. Aunt Linda stopped replying to my messages. Claire became distant, responding only with short texts. My father avoided the topic entirely, retreating into silence. And then the rumors started. Someone told me Linda was saying I had manipulated Mom. Someone else hinted that I had isolated her. Someone suggested I had taken advantage of her illness. No one said these things to my face. Not yet, but I could feel the lines being drawn. And I was standing alone on one side of them, holding something I never asked for, wondering how loving someone had somehow made me the villain. By the end of that week, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't going to blow over. This wasn't temporary. The will hadn't just divided property. It had exposed everything my family had been holding in for years, and they were just getting started. I thought distance might cool things down. That was my first mistake. I stayed quiet for a few days after meeting Mark. I didn't call. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. Part of me believed that if I gave everyone space, they'd remember who I was. They'd remember the years before this, the holidays, the shared jokes, the fact that I had never been the scheming one in the family. But silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes silence is just a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. It started with my sister. Claire called me late one night, her voice thin and tired. She asked how I was doing, and for a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe she was reaching out. Maybe she was still on my side. Then she asked very carefully, "Did Mom ever talk to you about changing the will?" I closed my eyes. "No," I said again. There was a pause, a long one. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, uneven, nervous. "It's just people are confused," she said. This wasn't what anyone expected. "Does that mean you're confused too?" I asked. Another pause. "I don't know what to think," she admitted. "It just feels sudden." Sudden. As if my mother's months of illness had been sudden. As if the countless nights I slept in that house hadn't happened. As if care only counted if it was witnessed. We hung up politely. Too politely. And when the call ended, I stared at my phone, feeling something sink inside me. Claire wasn't accusing me. Not outright. But she wasn't defending me either. The next sign came from my aunt. Linda had always been outspoken, the kind of woman who said exactly what she thought and expected everyone else to handle it. Growing up, she'd been both entertaining and exhausting. She loved to remind people of favors she'd done and sacrifices she'd made. She showed up at my door unannounced one afternoon. I knew it was her the moment I saw the car parked outside. My stomach tightened. I considered pretending I wasn't home, but it was too late. She was already knocking. She walked in without waiting for an invitation, eyes scanning the living room as if she were taking inventory. I noticed immediately that she didn't comment on anything. Not the flowers on the table. Not the photos on the wall. Not the familiar smell of my mother's favorite candles that I hadn't been able to bring myself to put away. She sat down and crossed her legs. "I'll be blunt," she said, "because that's who I am." I nodded, bracing myself. "Your mother wasn't herself at the end," Linda continued. "You know that." "I know she was sick," I said. "And vulnerable," she added. "People can be influenced when they're vulnerable." There it was. The accusation without the courage to call itself one. I told her I hadn't influenced anyone, that I hadn't even known about the will until it was read. That Mom had been lucid, clear, and very much herself. Linda listened, her expression tight, unconvinced. "I just think," she said, standing up, "that this is going to cause problems. And I don't want to see the family torn apart over a house." The irony almost made me laugh. After she left, I sat alone in the living room, replaying her words. Torn apart over a house. As if the house were the issue. As if this were about walls and windows and property taxes. It wasn't. It was about resentment. And resentment has a long memory. I began to notice things I hadn't before. Small shifts. Old comments suddenly making sense. Jokes that had always had an edge to them. Compliments that felt like comparisons. Mark had always been the successful one. The firstborn. The achiever. Claire had always been the peacemaker. The baby everyone protected. And I had always been the reliable one. The one people assumed would step in. The one whose life was considered flexible enough to absorb everyone else's needs. Reliability is invisible when everything is fine. It only becomes visible when it's rewarded. A week later, my father finally spoke. He invited me over for dinner, just the two of us. I arrived early like I always did, bringing food even though he hadn't asked. Old habits die hard. He moved slowly around the kitchen, quieter than usual. We ate without talking much. When he finally brought up the will, it wasn't emotional. It was practical. "You know this puts me in a difficult position," he said. "How?" I asked. "They're angry," he replied, "and they expect me to fix it." I waited for him to say more, to defend Mom's decision, to acknowledge my role in caring for her, to say anything that felt like support. Instead, he said, "Would you consider sharing?" Sharing. The word landed heavily between us. Sharing what? I asked. The house, he said. Or at least part of it. For the sake of peace. Peace. Another word people use when they don't want to confront unfairness. I looked at my father, suddenly seeing him not just as a grieving husband, but as a man tired of conflict, desperate for quiet, willing to ask the wrong person to make the sacrifice. "I didn't ask for this," I said again. It felt like a refrain now. "I know," he replied, "but sometimes we do things we didn't ask for." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him how many nights I'd stayed awake, listening for my mother's breathing. How many times I'd held her hand while she cried. How many parts of my own life I'd paused without complaint. Instead, I said, "I need time." He nodded, relief flickering across his face, as if my hesitation already felt like a concession. That was when I understood something painful. They weren't asking me to share because it was fair. They were asking because they believed I would. The pressure built quietly after that. Messages from relatives I barely spoke to. Casual comments disguised as concern. Suggestions framed as advice. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone knew what the right thing to do was. No one asked what I wanted. No one asked how I was coping. And slowly the narrative solidified. I was the one standing in the way of harmony. I was the one holding on to something I didn't deserve. I was the one creating division. It didn't matter how many times I told myself the truth. It didn't matter that the will was legal, clear, and deliberate. Once people decide who the villain is, facts become irrelevant. The breaking point came with the invitation. Claire texted me one afternoon, asking if I could come to dinner that weekend. She said everyone would be there. She said it would be good to talk things through as a family. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to say no. I could already feel the tension, the stares, the careful words, hiding sharp edges. But another part of me was tired of being talked about instead of talked to. So I said yes. I spent the days leading up to it rehearsing conversations in my head. I practiced calm responses. I reminded myself not to get defensive. I told myself that if I explained things clearly, if I stayed reasonable, they would listen. I told myself a lot of things. The house was full when I arrived. Familiar voices filled the air, but the warmth I remembered was gone. The smiles were polite. The hugs were brief. We sat around the table, plates full, tension thicker than the food on our forks. At first, the conversation stayed safe. Work, weather, small talk, avoidance disguised as civility. Then Mark put his fork down. "I think we should address the elephant in the room," he said. My heart began to race. Claire looked at her plate. Aunt Linda folded her arms. My father stared at the table. Everyone waited. This was it. This was where the sides would stop being implied and start being spoken out loud. And as Mark opened his mouth again, I realized something with startling clarity. This dinner wasn't about understanding. It was about pressure. And no matter what I said next, someone was going to walk away feeling betrayed. Mark didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That was the thing about him. He had always known how to sound reasonable, even when what he was saying wasn't. "I just think we need clarity," he said, folding his hands together on the table. "Because right now everyone's confused, and that confusion is hurting the family." No one disagreed. Silence is agreement when no one wants to be the first to speak. "I don't understand what needs clarifying," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The will was clear. "That's the problem," Aunt Linda cut in. "It was too clear, as if someone made sure of it." My stomach tightened. I looked at her. "Are you saying I manipulated, Mom?" She didn't answer directly. "I'm saying people don't make drastic changes like that without influence." Mark nodded. Claire still wouldn't look at me. "So that's it," I said. "You think I did something wrong." "We're just asking questions," Mark replied quickly. "There's no need to get defensive." There it was, the familiar reversal. Accuse first, then criticize the reaction. I'm not defensive, I said. I'm responding. My father finally spoke. Let's keep things calm. Calm. Always calm. Even if it meant swallowing injustice. I took care of her, I said, turning to him. You know that. We know you helped, Claire said softly. Helped. The word stung more than I expected. I didn't help, I said. I was there. Every day. No one responded. Aunt Linda leaned forward. And no one is denying that. But care doesn't entitle someone to everything. Everything. I laughed then. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity finally cracked something open in me. The house, I said. You mean the house? Mark sighed, as if I were being difficult. It's a major asset. And Mom always said she wanted things divided equally. Did she say that recently? I asked. He hesitated. I don't know, he admitted, but that was always the understanding. The understanding, the unspoken agreement everyone had decided existed, even if it never actually did. Mom changed her mind, I said. People are allowed to do that. Or she was pressured, Linda said. That was it. I pushed my chair back, slightly, the legs scraping against the floor. Every face at the table turned toward me. I didn't pressure anyone, I said, my voice firm. And if you believe I did, then say it outright. No one did, because saying it outright would make it real. It would turn implication into accusation, and that required courage. Instead, Mark said, this doesn't have to get ugly. Then stop making it ugly, I replied. The tension snapped. Claire finally looked up, her eyes glossy. Can't you just compromise, she asked. For Mom's sake. For Mom's sake. My mother, who had written the will. My mother, whose decision they were questioning. You want me to undo her last choice. I asked. We want you to be fair, Mark said. There it was again. Fair. Fair according to who? According to the siblings who weren't there? According to the sister who visited occasionally? According to the aunt who lived 3 towns away? I'm not keeping anyone from anything else, I said. There were other assets. But the house is emotional, Claire said. It's memories. Yes, I agreed. They're my memories, too. The room went quiet, and then Linda said something I will never forget. You were always closer to her, she said. That doesn't mean you should benefit more. The words hit me like a slap, as if closeness were a crime, as if love needed to be penalized to keep things even. I felt something harden inside me. I didn't ask to be closer, I said. I stepped up when no one else could. That was your choice, Mark replied. And there it was, the justification. Because it was my choice, it didn't count. Because I chose to care, it was expected. Because I chose to stay, I owed them the outcome. I'm done, I said quietly. I stood up, my legs shaking, my chest tight. You've already decided who I am in this story. Nothing I say will change that. My father finally looked at me, real fear in his eyes. Don't walk away like this. I already have, I replied. I left before anyone could stop me. The drive home was a blur. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. My mind replayed every word, every glance, every moment where someone could have defended me and chose not to. By the time I reached the house, I felt hollow. The house. My house. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a battlefield I hadn't wanted to fight on. The days after the dinner were worse. The story spread. Suddenly, people weren't just confused anymore. They were certain. Certainty is more dangerous than doubt. Certainty gives people permission to judge without listening. I heard that Mark was telling people I was being stubborn, that I was letting money come between family, that I was changing. Claire stopped calling entirely. Aunt Linda told anyone who would listen that Mom had been manipulated at the end. And my father stopped answering my messages. That hurt more than everything else combined. I started to question myself, not about the will, about my place in the family. Had I always been the one expected to give? Had my role always been conditional? Was love in our family something you earned by being useful? Late one night, as I sat alone in the living room, I found myself staring at an old photo on the mantel. It was of me and Mom, taken years ago. We were laughing, her arm around my shoulders. I realized then that this wasn't just about inheritance. It was about what my mother had seen, what she had chosen to acknowledge, and what everyone else now felt exposed by. They weren't just angry about the house. They were angry because the will had forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. And instead of facing it, they decided it was easier to turn me into the problem. I went to bed that night knowing something irreversible had happened. The family I thought I had was gone, and the next move wouldn't come from me. It would come from them. I woke up the next morning to a notification that didn't make sense at first. It was an email from the lawyer. The subject line was neutral, professional, almost harmless. But the moment I opened it, my stomach dropped. He wanted to schedule a meeting, not to explain anything, not to clarify paperwork, to discuss concerns raised by other beneficiaries. Other beneficiaries. I sat on the edge of my bed, reading that line over and over again. My name was on the house. The will had been read. There were no ambiguities. And yet here we were. They had gone to a lawyer. Not to talk to me. Not to talk to each other. To challenge it. I replied calmly, agreeing to meet. There was no point in refusing. If anything, refusal would only feed the narrative they were already building. The meeting was set for later that week. In the days leading up to it, I received messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Cousins, family friends, people who had no stake in the will but plenty of opinions. Some were subtle, just checking in. Some weren't. I hope you're doing the right thing. The right thing. Everyone had a version of it, and somehow in every version, it involved me giving something up. The day of the meeting, I arrived early again. Old habits. The same cold office. The same stiff chairs. This time, Mark and Linda were already there. Claire arrived shortly after. My father came last, his face drawn, his shoulders slumped. The lawyer greeted us all with the same polite professionalism, but the energy in the room was different now. Charged. Confrontational. He explained that concerns had been raised about the validity of the will, about my mother's mental state at the time it was signed, about potential undue influence. Undue influence. The phrase echoed in my head. These concerns are serious, the lawyer said carefully. But at this stage, they are allegations, not conclusions. I watched my family as he spoke. Mark looked determined. Linda looked vindicated. Claire looked conflicted. My father looked exhausted. I asked the only question that mattered. Do you believe the will is valid? I said. The lawyer met my gaze. Based on the documentation and my interactions with your mother, yes. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Mark leaned forward. Then why are we here? To discuss whether this can be resolved without litigation, the lawyer replied. Litigation. A word that felt unreal coming from people who shared my last name. Linda spoke next. We just want what's fair. Of course she did. The lawyer turned to me. Would you consider mediation? There it was again. The assumption that I would bend, that I would soften, that I would sacrifice to make everyone else comfortable. I'll consider it, I said. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see how far they were willing to go. The meeting ended without resolution. We left the office the same way we always did now. Separately. Silent. That night my phone rang. It was Claire. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice was shaky. They're serious, she said. Mark and Aunt Linda are talking about court. I know, I replied. She hesitated. If it comes to that, it's going to get ugly. It already is, I said. She sighed. I don't want to lose you. The word surprised me. Then why aren't you standing up for me? I asked gently. She didn't have an answer. A week later, the letter arrived. Official. Legal. Formal. They were contesting the will. My hands shook as I read it. Not because I was afraid of losing. The lawyer had been clear. The evidence was strong. My mother's intentions were documented. Her mental capacity had been evaluated. What shook me was the finality of it. This wasn't emotional anymore. This was war. The house began to feel different after that. Less like a sanctuary, more like a target. I found myself locking doors more often, checking windows, jumping at sounds. I started to dread the mail. Then came the deepest betrayal of all. One afternoon, my father showed up unannounced. He looked older than I remembered, smaller. He sat across from me in the living room, his hands clasped tightly together. "They're tearing each other apart," he said, "and you're in the middle of it." "I didn't put myself here," I replied. "I know," he said quietly, "but I need to ask you something." I already knew what was coming. "Will you give it up?" he asked. "Not share, not compromise. Give it up." "For what?" I asked. "For peace," he said. The word felt hollow now. "I can't," I said. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. "They're saying terrible things," he continued, "about your mother, about you. Then why are you here asking me to fix it?" I asked. He didn't answer. "I took care of her," I said, my voice breaking despite myself. "I loved her, and she loved me. Why is that being treated like something shameful?" His eyes filled with tears. "Because it makes people feel guilty." That was the first honest thing anyone had said in weeks. "I'm tired," he whispered. "I just want this to stop." "So do I," said, "but not like this." He left without another word. After that, I stopped pretending things might go back to normal. I gathered documents, emails, medical records, notes from my mother. I prepared myself, not just legally, but emotionally. I realized something important during that time. They weren't fighting me because they thought they'd win. They were fighting me because losing meant admitting something they weren't ready to face. And the closer we got to court, the uglier it became. They started digging into my life, questioning my finances, my career, my character. They wanted to paint a picture of me that justified what they were doing. And then one evening my lawyer called with information that made my blood run cold. "There's something you should know," he said. "One of them has evidence they plan to use." "What kind of evidence?" I asked. He hesitated. "A private conversation," he said, "between you and your mother." My heart pounded. I knew exactly which conversation he meant, and I knew it had never been meant to be heard by anyone else. I didn't sleep that night. The lawyer's words kept looping in my head over and over again. A private conversation. There were only a few moments in those final months that could qualify. Moments where my mother had spoken freely, without filters, without the careful politeness she used with everyone else. Moments she trusted only to me. By morning, I knew which one they meant. It was the night she told me why she'd changed the will. She had been weak that evening, too tired to sit up in bed, her voice barely more than a whisper. I remember sitting beside her, holding her hand, listening to the machines hum softly in the background. She had asked me if I ever felt invisible. I'd laughed at first, thinking she was talking about herself. Then she squeezed my hand and said, "I'm talking about you." She told me she'd watched our family for years, how she'd seen who showed up when things were inconvenient, who stepped back when life got messy, who assumed someone else would handle the hard parts. She told me she loved all her children, that she didn't love one more than the others. "But I see you," she'd said, "and I don't want that to go unacknowledged." I hadn't recorded that conversation. I'd never dreamed I'd need to. But someone else had been in the house that night. Aunt Linda. The realization hit me like ice water. She must have overheard us, or part of it, or enough to twist it into something else. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I was ready for. Walking into the courtroom felt surreal. The formality, the seriousness, the weight of what we were about to do to each other. I sat at the table with my lawyer, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across the room, my family sat together. Together. Mark avoided my eyes. Claire looked torn in half. Linda sat upright, confident, almost satisfied. My father sat slightly apart, staring straight ahead. The proceedings began slowly. Legal arguments, documents presented, medical evaluations confirming my mother's mental clarity. My lawyer laid out the facts calmly, methodically. The will had been updated months before her condition worsened. Witnesses had been present. Assessments had been conducted. Everything pointed to one conclusion. The will was valid. Then it was their turn. Linda's lawyer stood and introduced the evidence. An audio recording. My chest tightened. They played it. It wasn't the full conversation, just fragments. My mother's voice, weak but clear, talking about feeling disappointed, about recognizing sacrifice, about wanting to make things right. Out of context, it sounded like exactly what they wanted it to sound like she'd been influenced, like she'd been persuaded, like she'd been convinced. I could hear murmurs ripple through the room. My lawyer stood immediately. He objected. He questioned the legality of the recording, the lack of consent, the missing context. The judge allowed it to remain on record, but instructed the court to consider its limitations. Still, the damage was done. I felt sick. I glanced at my family. Mark looked resolute. Linda looked pleased. Claire looked horrified. This was the moment they thought would break me. They were wrong. When it was my turn to speak, my lawyer asked if I wished to address the court. I stood. My legs felt unsteady, but my voice didn't. I didn't talk about money. I didn't talk about the house. I talked about care. I talked about the nights spent awake, the fear, the small, unglamorous moments that never make it into stories. I talked about my mother's autonomy, her clarity, her right to make decisions without being erased the moment they became inconvenient to others. Then I did something no one expected. I told the whole conversation, not the version they recorded, the real one. I repeated my mother's words as best I could, about invisibility, about guilt, about love that doesn't always look equal from the outside. I looked directly at Linda. She wasn't asking me to take anything from anyone, I said. She was asking me to stop disappearing. The courtroom was silent. My lawyer then introduced additional evidence. Emails, notes, statements my mother had written, all expressing the same intent, all dated well before her final decline. The narrative began to crack. Then came the cross-examination. Linda was asked about the recording, about how it was obtained, about consent. She stumbled. The confidence drained from her face as questions stacked up. Why hadn't she shared the full recording? Why hadn't she mentioned it earlier? Why had she waited until litigation? Her answers were vague, defensive. The judge listened carefully. By the time the hearing ended, the air in the room felt different. The decision didn't come immediately. We were told it would be delivered in writing. We left the courtroom without speaking. I sat alone in my car afterward, shaking, not from fear, from release. For the first time since the will had been read, I felt like I had been heard. Days later, the ruling arrived. The will stood. The contest was dismissed. My mother's intentions were upheld. Legally, it was over. Emotionally, it wasn't. Mark didn't call. Claire sent a brief message saying she was glad it was resolved, but she needed time. Linda said nothing. My father came by once. He hugged me longer than usual. He didn't apologize, but he didn't ask me to give anything up again either. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong, because winning doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it just makes the truth unavoidable, and the truth has consequences no one prepares you for. After the ruling, the noise stopped. No more letters, no more calls from lawyers, no more whispered accusations passed through third parties. Legally, everything was settled, but peace didn't arrive the way I expected it to. The house felt different once the fight was over. Not lighter, not calmer, just quieter. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of everything you've lost along the way. I walked through the rooms slowly in those first weeks, noticing details I'd been too distracted to see before. The worn spot on the carpet where my mother used to stand while cooking. The drawer she never bothered to organize. The dent in the hallway wall from when Mark and I were kids and threw a ball inside like we weren't told not to. This place held my history, but now it also held the memory of what it cost me. Claire eventually came by. She stood awkwardly in the doorway at first, like a guest instead of a sister. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd once done homework together, and talked carefully, as if one wrong word might reopen everything. "I didn't know what to do," she said finally. I felt stuck in the middle. "I know," I replied, and I meant it, but understanding doesn't erase hurt. She admitted she'd felt overlooked growing up, that she'd assumed Mom favored me because I was always there, that the will had forced her to confront feelings she'd never wanted to admit. "I didn't think it would go that far," she said quietly. Neither did I. Mark never came. We exchanged one final message months later. Polite, distant, final. There was no apology, just an acknowledgement that things were different now. Aunt Linda faded out of my life completely. I heard through others that she was still angry, that she still believed what she wanted to believe. I stopped caring. My father and I found a new rhythm, not the old one, but something steadier, more honest. He no longer asked me to smooth things over. He no longer pretended everything was fine. One evening, sitting in the living room, he said, "Your mother would be proud of you." It was the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get, and it was enough. Over time, I began to understand something that had taken me far too long to see. The will didn't break my family. It revealed it. It showed me who valued peace over truth, who saw sacrifice as an obligation instead of a gift, who believed fairness meant sameness, even when circumstances were different. And it showed me who I was when I finally stopped shrinking to keep everyone else comfortable. Keeping the house didn't make me rich. It didn't make me happy overnight. What it did was give me permission. Permission to honor my mother's choice. Permission to accept that love doesn't need to be justified. Permission to let go of relationships that only worked when I gave and never received. I used to believe family meant loyalty, no matter what. Now I believe family means respect. And respect doesn't ask you to disappear. Sometimes I sit on the front porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip behind the trees, and I think about that moment in the lawyer's office. The exact second when my name was read and everything shifted. That was the moment the will was read, and my family immediately chose sides. They made their choices. So did I. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that standing your ground will cost you people who are only standing with you because you were convenient. But it will also save you from losing yourself. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think I should have given up the house to keep the family together? Or do you believe honoring my mother's final decision was the right thing to do, even if it meant standing alone? Which side would you have chosen? Let me know your thoughts.